Welcome to Face2Face. This is a show about change and what's next. It's a show that asks questions and peels back the layers of our average everyday experience and goes beyond scratching the surface. We interview people doing incredible things who are making a difference around the globe. Join me as we listen in and get one step closer to understanding that big ideas shared create collaboration. Collaboration can inspire community, and communities create social change. I'm David Peck, and this is Face2Face. So my next interview, again, was a real treat for me. It's with director, filmmaker, producer, writer Rodrigo Reyes. His new film, 499 or 499, is I guess you could say in a way it's a celebration. It's a step into the 500th year anniversary of colonialism, frankly, in Mexico. And it's a film that is moving. It's compelling. It's engaging on so many levels. The cinematography is stunning. It's a fascinating road movie, frankly. And for those of you who like road movies, this is one with a bit of a twist. And he brings together, this sense of poetry and magical realism, I guess, together to make contact with reality in really, truly moving and meaningful ways. And so it's kind of, I think I've read somewhere that it's a hybrid documentary. I'm not sure that I would call it that, but it certainly brings genres together in a really interesting and fascinating way. And also has this ability to reach in and really touch you in significant ways, in a emotional, spiritual, and a heartfelt way. So it's a real bridge to I believe, to the future and to this thing we call hope. We talk about the system. We talk about narrative and narrative structure. We talk about victims of violence and journalism and how important it is to step in and tell the truth. And one of the things Rodrigo and I really spent a fair bit of time on is this idea of listening and how important it is to be heard and to be acknowledged, and how transformation actually is going to come through that. Rodrigo has quite a history of history in his background. His father's a historian, and he's a political scientist academically. And so he has stepped into this filmmaking world in a really interesting way as he tells other people's stories and tells his own stories. He talks about context, and we talk about stepping into other universes and the destruction of knowledge and what are, cinematic solutions to these problems. And so I hope I piqued your interest. This is an interview that I believe you're going to really enjoy. I sure did. And Rodrigo is a wonderful guy, fun, great sense of humor. I'm looking forward to part two, and absolutely looking forward to his next film. But it is playing at Hot Docs online. And if you miss the date on that by the time you actually get to hear this interview, which is highly possible, I hope you'll seek this out. It's the number 499, coming up on the 500th year anniversary of the explorer Cortez making his way through Veracruz and into Mexico City ultimately. And this roadway of violence, if that's fair. And I hope, Rodrigo, that's okay to talk about that. And so step in here with me now into this conversation and make sure you make note of the film as well. And don't forget davidpecklive.com for more information about my speaking and my writing. Copy of my book, Real Change is Incremental, is there. I'd love for you to purchase that. And then Face2Face Live, over 500 interviews now. We have crossed that mark. It's crazy that we've had this many conversations, and I can't wait to have that many more. Always peeling back the layers, always learning something else and something new. Casual conversation, intelligent inspiration. My guests are amazing, and I am so blessed and so thrilled and so just amazed, I suppose you could say, that we're still going strong. Advertising is beginning. We've got a newsletter. We have a website that's getting a ton of traffic. So if you're interested in getting your word on the street, please reach out to us. We can do that. I can also facilitate your conversations, your podcasts, your online events as well. And during COVID and this crisis that we're in, Zoom seems to be the way that we're going. And I'm starting to actually host and facilitate large online events as well. So reach out if you want to advertise with us, if you want to step in. And if you can't do any of that, and don't forget about Patreon as well, folks, for those of you who can support us that way, we'd really appreciate it. please do leave us a review on iTunes. I hope at least a 3-star review. 4 or 5 would be preferable. And then maybe a one line about why you listen or what's important. Sign up for the newsletter. Send it to your friends, social mediate us. We would so appreciate getting word on the street. It's a challenge out there. It's noisy in the podcasting world, but we are committed to continuing this ongoing conversation. And then, of course, rabble.ca is a platform where Face2Face is also still hosted. Check us out there. Lots of writers, bloggers, podcasters, thinkers who, news for the rest of us. They're talking about things that matter. So step into that if and when we will. And don't forget, coming right up, Rodrigo Reyes and his new film, 499. Let's hope we see Rodrigo at the Oscars next year. Well, welcome to Face2Face. We're joined by a very special guest today with us here. And once again, sadly, COVID and all, we are not face-to-face. And unfortunately, the distance between us would probably have gotten in the way. But we have with us here Rodrigo Reyes to talk about his new film, 499. 499, I guess, Rodrigo. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for inviting me, David.
So why don't we just step right in? But before we do that, I love this film. It's stunning. It's gorgeous. It's heartbreaking and engaging, and so thoughtful. And the performance from Eduardo is it's stunning. So anyway, I just wanted to say congratulations. And you're at Hot Docs this year. You this winner of the special jury prize, winner of cinematography at Tribeca. So anyway, Rodrigo, congrats.
Thank you so much. I'm glad you loved the film.
I really did, and I hope everyone sees it for so many reasons. Not only is it a gorgeous, stunning film, it's an important film as well. And I think that years ago I kind of tried to make that distinction between great and important, and sometimes they both meet. Why 499?
Well, it's this whole idea of anniversaries, right? We have these celebrations that we mark, the bicentennial in the US. And, anniversaries are endowed with all this power, right? They're like these nodes of history. And next year, 2021, will be 500 years that Cortez conquered the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. So it's a huge, huge moment in world history, in colonial history, and especially in Mexican history. For a lot of people, this is the moment where Mexico as a concept or nation is born. So I wanted to make a film about this issue. I've been wanting to make it for forever, because my dad's a historian. So
Okay.
my dad, when I was a little kid, my funnest, moments as a 5-year-old were going to museums with my dad and just looking at these amazing artifacts and learning about the history of these civilizations that had been conquered by the Spanish in this very epic kind of way. And I've always been fascinated with this anniversary. And so when I realized those 500 years were coming, I knew I had to make a movie. But I also knew that we couldn't just celebrate that anniversary. It's an incomplete, there's something there that's missing. So we took a number off, and I think that 499 makes it so compelling. What we're about to get to this round number, but it's imperfect.
I would say, yeah, it's. I would say pretty imperfect after watching the film. It's this. I guess you say it's a series of repetitions in a sense. You kind of end there, but it's about the past, it's about the future, it's about the present as well, and a really fascinating way that you bring kind of documentary film and narrative together, and in a really poetic and magical way.
Well, the film basically follows the character of a fictional conquistador, right? Like he's from the 16th century, and he materializes in modern Mexico, and it's a narrative device to allow us to bring into the film this clash of times, right? The past and the present, and as he goes on his journey from the coast of Veracruz into the highlands and the capital city, he meets with the victims of violence, like people who are real people who are living with some of the harshest and most difficult problems going on in Mexico today, from the murder of journalists to migrants fleeing Central America, and also feminicides, the violent gender violence, murder of young women in Mexico. So he meets all these real people who have gone through very serious things. And so in a way, like, where the film creates this question of, like, is this history present? Is it repeating
Mm.
itself? Is the violence, still here? And I think we asked ourselves that, like, especially now with the COVID crisis and so many other problems in the world, where there's this question lingering of, like, why does this stuff keep happening? Why is it repeating itself?
Yeah, why does it keep happening? So are you it's fascinating that your father was a historian. How did you end up becoming a filmmaker and not a historian?
He always exposed me to film as well. I remember
Mm.
watching films as a kid, and just I've always loved film. I've always wanted to be a filmmaker. I studied political science though in UC
Oh,
San
okay. Yeah.
Diego.
Makes
Yeah,
sense.
yeah. I had this duty.
Gotta go after those colonials, eh, Rodrigo?
Yeah, and then just I had this duty as the oldest, and we migrated to California, so I had this duty to do something respectable, right? And so poli sci was respectable, but then as soon as I got my diploma from college, I just went off and started making movies right away.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I'm glad you did. It's amazing. The Did I read somewhere that when you stepped into this, even maybe as far into the editing process, post production, you weren't quite sure whether or not you still had a movie?
I was not sure. The whole movie's an experiment, and I think, like, would this work? Would you be able to believe that we created this character and that he's interacting with real people? And would you actually, as the viewer, would you go along on this odyssey? Would you
Right,
accept this anachronism? And we didn't know. I mean, it really, it was such an intense shoot, like, we were on the road for 7 weeks total in two
wow,
parts. And so we would just, like, we had no control over the circumstances. We would set up, like, in a marketplace, and then try to make the marketplace work in the film with the character. And then also we had to navigate these collaborations with the real people, right? Because you
right,
couldn't you,
right,
did, you didn't just show up and just interview them like a journalist would. They had to be on board with the whole idea of even meeting a conquistador and letting this character into their home, and really listening to what we were trying to do, but we also had to listen to them and adapt the
mm,
film to their input, right? Because you couldn't make a film about colonialism and be colonialist at the same time, right?
right, right. I love how you just mentioned you had to listen to them, they had to listen to you. Doing, as my listeners will know, I've been working in development for many years, and I've always said that what makes a great development worker or a great student is the ability, three things: one, you got to listen; two, you got to listen; three, you got to listen. This film is about that for me, and I see Eduardo's character, this conquistador, in a way, even though he starts out with this arrogant kind of, we're here to enslave you in front of the school children. It's just so sort of absurd in a certain way, and yet, through this road trip, this journey, he kind of comes to realize it is about paying attention. It is about listening. And yet, and I guess maybe Rodrigo being able to empathize.
Totally. I mean, let's just think about how important listening is as an action. Just how important how subversive listening is. Like,
That's cool.
look at what's happening in the U.S. right now in Minnesota, right? Like, there's these uh, protests and this
Hmm.
outrage for just a totally incomprehensible murder, right? And the greatest request, I think, on the streets and in everybody's mind in the US right now is, like, listen to what's going on, like, listen, and this need to be heard and to be acknowledged and to be really a part of that conversation is so subversive, and there's a reason why structures of power don't want to listen, right?
Mm,
And so I thought a lot about that when I made this film, because you could say, well, why do we need to follow the conquistador? He's the bad guy, right?
right.
He's the colonizer. Why do we need to listen? Why do we need to follow his story, right? But that's exactly the point. It's like if you can have this power, this person who embodies power, if he can listen, then there is a possibility to transform. I feel very strongly about that. I don't want to say that that he is beyond listening and beyond dialogue. I think that's just a very self-serving. It makes me feel good maybe to say, well, he's a bad guy, and by
Right.
extension, I'm a good guy. But really, that's what needs to happen. We need to have this dialogue across history.
It reminds me a little bit of, and I don't know if this is what you were going for or not, but oh, come on, this is horrible. Terrence Malick's film about Pocahontas. Um, can we remember what that is off the
The
bat?
New
Wow.
World, yeah.
The new, yeah, of course. I just watched it not that long ago, actually. But there's obviously there's correlations and there's connections there. But I love how Eduardo is able to bring us into that, and I actually felt like, yes, he is the bad guy and all that he represents, and yet certainly by the time he gets to the garbage dump at the end, which is absolutely wonderful, by the way, um, I'm not on his side, but I'm feeling for him, and I love that we've kind of come in a way back to hope. In a sense, you strike me as a pretty hopeful person, Rodrigo, but we sort of end there, and I think that's really fascinating.
Yeah, I think the conversation about our history has to be relevant to our hopes for the future, right? Like, history only matters if it teaches us something about ourselves that we can
Right.
use. And I think so many countries are grappling with their history or avoiding their history, right? And we need to use it as a possibility to build together. It'd be great if we could just exercise and erase all the bad stuff that we've gone
Mm,
through, but we can't. It's already happened. We can only come to terms with our history, right? And so I feel for the conquistador, because he
mm,
he he is degraded by this journey. He's forced to listen to what he would never want to hear, right? He's never wanted to confront the effects of what he did. He was just a
right.
soldier in this crazy dream of empire, right? And I think the film reminds us of his humanity without celebrating him or making him into some sort of a hero.
Does he ever? I don't actually remember in the film, and certainly there are I would call them sort of moments of recognition or shocks of recognition for him, and certainly the facial expressions, just wonderful. Is there ever a realization? Does he actually come out and say, I can see this 500-year link here. I can connect those dots.
I think that's really open to interpretation how
Mm,
much the character has listened, but we have, right, we've gone
right.
on the journey of the film, and I think we're there watching him as he goes through all these stages and moves through these amazing, incredibly beautiful landscapes, and listens to these harrowing stories of people who share them with a lot of honesty and just a lot of commitment to their story. And so it's really up to us, I think. What he does with his life, it almost becomes irrelevant, I think, by the end of the film.
Mm. His notebook, is that the academic in you coming out?
Well, so the character has
So
a
love that little
diary.
detail, by the way. Yeah, that's
Yeah,
right. Yeah.
he has a diary, and I just wanted to give a nod to these chronicles of colonial eras. Right, there's all these
Mm,
chronicles. Cortez himself wrote letters to the king where he was constantly trying to spin things. And so here he is remembering through this diary that he's given by one of the characters, right? Early on, the son of a murdered journalist gives him a notebook and
Mm,
basically is telling him, write and think. And so as he writes
yeah.
and thinks, he's remembering his past, and we get to listen to that past and have some idea of what he did, and you could start to hear his version. It isn't an
Right.
objective voice, and I think that that's just a natural inclination to try to spin everything into positive. But it starts to become impossible, I think, to keep spinning the past in light of the present, right? Like you could keep saying, for instance, in the US that we've overcome slavery, but the effects of that trauma linger and are
Mm.
still incredibly damaging and horrific today, right? So as you start to contrast his voice with the voices of real people, you get this very rich clash, I think, of visions.
I think it's interesting. I love the opening scene of him washing up on shore. If he had landed in the ship with the other soldiers, sailors, and people on the boat, his experience probably would have been different. And I'm not sure where I'm going with this, but it just bubbled up to the surface as you were chatting a little bit about the diary and about listening. So on his own, he has this ability 500 years later to say, or at least I think he does anyway. There's culpability there. There's this maybe a sense of justice, perhaps, and where did we go wrong, and look what we ended up, being a part of. We should have known better, sort of a thing. Had he arrived with a bunch of people on the shore, his experience might have been different. Is there something about that independent, sort of soulful journey? Does that make sense, Rodrigo?
Yeah, I mean, I think we don't know why he was chosen, right?
Right.
There's no explanation. You know, when you watch the film, for folks who get to watch it out in Toronto during the festival, um, there's no explanation. Like, forget about that stuff. Like, just some random, forces of history or the universe just pick this man, and isolating him allows him really to challenge himself and to
Mm,
go into a different kind of journey. If he was with his buddies, they might kind of just build a bubble together, but it becomes
right.
impossible for him to do that. And I think that's just human beings were contextualized, right? So, like, if you take us out of our context and you suddenly meet people in the community that you hate or that you're prejudiced against, or that you have assumptions about, it's just so different when you make that personal connection and you break out of your social bubble.
Well, I love Rodrigo that really his redemption, if we can call it that, maybe small r redemption, comes through personal narrative.
In
Is that,
what sense?
well, just as he listens to others, as he steps into these other stories, and I wonder, like, I just, Roger Ebert, empathy making machines. That's what films are. The idea that there is power in story, that we're going to change the world by telling new stories, and so on. I was interviewing a woman recently, Michelle Stevenson, her new film
Mhm.
Stateless. And I asked her, and I want to ask you the same question, because you kind of end the film with, the monk saying to him, the Indians are more Christian than you Spaniards. And I think that's fascinating that the monk was able to see that, but the Spaniards weren't. And I asked Michelle the same question: why this person and not that person? Like, what is it about our history? What is it about our series of repetitions that we go through that allows us to, at some point, say, wow, this is not the way it should be, right? And that, because I think that's what I'm really all about, is trying to get people to step into that sense of, how do we change the narrative? How do we change the way things are? I don't know if that
I
makes
think
sense.
I think we have to have the courage to really step into another universe. I think
Mm,
the reason colonialism, is sustained is because we don't step out of our universes. We don't get, transported into another time and another experience. of reality. I think that's the key, right? It's like this courage to be vulnerable, and so many of our conflicts socially are about one side being afraid of the other, right?
Mm,
um, and so at the same time, in the case of the character in the film, like, he is a lot less important than he thinks he is, right? Like, he's
right.
just a soldier. And so what I found fascinating was, meeting the real people, and listening to their stories of violence, and how they have survived, and how they are seeking justice in many cases, and that courage that they have, and how they are brave even in light of being victimized constantly. It's a big contrast with this character who feels sorry for himself, but really he's coming into this world at the top. He's coming in with a
Mm,
lot of power, and yet these folks have no power, but they're fighting and they're resisting, and they have so much more hope, I think, than he does. They're a
right.
lot less afraid of this fight than he is.
So you talked about vulnerability. How were you able to step into some of those stories? I mean, these are very difficult stories to hear, especially sort of Lorena's and Fatima's. I mean, it's just you. As I listened, I just and got deeper into how things played out. How can you not shake your head and just say this isn't possible, right? This is the stuff of fiction. We don't treat other people like this, but the reality is we do, and we have, and it happens all the time. Um, how were you able to? Speaking of that courage, just being able to draw that out. I mean, there must have been such an incredible amount of trust there.
Yeah, I mean, I knew very early on that there was lots of ways to make the film, but I wanted this character to encounter people living with the extreme violence that happens
Mm.
in many parts of Mexico, and sadly, all of these stories live along the route that Cortez actually took. So we were
Oh
able to
wow,
stay true to the history and
isn't that wow?
true to the film, and what my approach to the collaboration, as I see it, with the real people in the film was just to be completely honest and radically transparent, and say to them, this is what my film is about. My film is
Mm,
about you connecting your story to 500 years of
right,
of this history, these weapons of control and conquest that have transformed. So for instance, like, the first character that the conquistador meets is the son of a murdered journalist, and
right,
Mexico is one of the most dangerous countries to be a journalist. It's just incredible how many people, quality journalists who are investigating serious issues, have been murdered. And so he meets the son of one of them, and the conversation with Jorge about his dad. His dad's name was Moises Sanchez. Moises was killed by a local, like, a politician who didn't like his reporting about local issues, and so it seems very modern and very constrained to the circumstances of Veracruz. But my pitch to his son was like, well, this is so similar to the centuries of erasing voices and narratives.
right.
Like, famously, the Spanish burnt a lot of sacred texts, and we've lost a lot of stories and a lot of knowledge because they destroyed so much of it. And it's no different from the destruction of knowledge that is happening when a journalist is murdered. And so I would make these very sincere and transparent pitches to each person. And whenever I could, I would talk to them over the phone, and then we
Mm,
would meet, and then we would visit with the crew, and the actor Eduardo would also listen to the testimonies of the people as they spoke to me. So he was there helping me with building this rapport, and really just interacting with them, so that they could trust that we would listen, and we would really do do right by them. And also, very importantly, and people who watch the film will notice that each scene kind of changes in style a little bit or in tone,
Mm.
because we listen to their input as well creatively. So there's a moment in the film where the conquistador meets a poet. He's imprisoned.
Yes.
He's arrested by an indigenous police force, and he meets a local poet. And the poet was the one who came up with this concept of arresting him and then speaking to the character only with poetry. He didn't want to do a classic interview. He wanted to do a poem. And I found that just so fascinating. And it was a challenge to take the ideas of real people and then figure out what the cinematic solution was, right? So that the film could kind of
Mm.
flex and move through these spaces while listening to the real input, right,
Mm.
of all these people. So that's why I didn't know if we had a film, because it was every day was a gamble, but
Well,
we had to do it that way, right? Because
yeah. It's a wild experiment. Hey, can you? I do want to talk about that man that was murdered, because I think his son was saying something about how his father had talked about, if we do nothing, if we keep silent, this is going to continue. And 500 years later, it's still continuing. And why was his dad motivated? Why is Fatima's mother motivated? You know what I mean? How is it you can stand on the one side and not the other? I don't think there's a really clear answer there, Rodrigo, but I'd love to hear you speak into that, having spent time with some of these folks.
Well, Fatima is a young girl whose story is told by her mother in the film, and she was the victim of a horrible, horrible sexual assault and murder, which it's a huge problem in Mexico. It happens all the time that that women are victimized, and often with a ridiculous degree of impunity. I think the percentages are above 90%. 90% of cases of feminicides are not processed or convicted. So it's shocking. And what really struck me about her mother's testimony, which is just heartbreaking, absolutely heartbreaking, and just so incredibly honest, right? Like, she's
Mm-hmm.
so honest
It's
and
remarkable.
clear. She has endured a level of pain that most of us will never ever encounter. And what what keeps her going, I think, is this notion of justice, of
Mm.
not the legal justice, but just like
Right.
the injustice of someone having been murdered when she was just a teenager, just beginning her life, just in complete innocence, right? And so, like, I think that this idea of being in this path of justice at a deep fundamental level is very empowering, and it allows you to survive this trauma and gives meaning, right? And so we respected that deeply and really tried to capture it in a way where cinematically it was engaging, but you engaging in such a way that you could really feel the full power of this story. And for instance, with Lorena, Fatima's mom, like, we sat down for 3.5 hours and recorded those 3.5 hours of her testimony, of her telling her daughter's story and her family's, like, the aftermath of that story is also terrible. And we sat there for the whole thing. We didn't just say, this is what we need,
Right.
and off we go. No, we sat and offered her as much respect as we could, while also remembering that we're here to make a film. And so, you were asking, what is it that keeps you going? I think, as a filmmaker, I've been lucky to learn, in different projects and from different people, that you have a responsibility, and your responsibility is this film. This film has to be worthwhile, worth you being there, worth like all of this effort, and really worth asking people to relive this trauma, because it's traumatic, right? When you ask someone to talk
Mm.
about some of the worst things that have ever happened to them. So you have to make it worth it. And so I always go back to that, because you can really easily feel sorry for yourself, or like apply your politics to things, and really not give audiences the most that cinema can give, which is like this amazing immersive experience of connecting with other human beings and other experiences. So I always reminded myself of that. And for folks who watch the film and see Fatima's story, that's how I got through that. And that's why I think it's so powerful, is because we were able to just give space to her mother, and to really capture her to the best of our ability, and let her kind of own the screen and tell her story.
Mm. I'd love to talk a little bit about the cinematography, the space that you've created, the sound design, all of those pieces that, when they come together, just have, create that sense of import and impact, I guess you could say. Moments like the shot of the police pickup trucks, what I think might have been part of the border wall, the conquistador picking up a plastic cup. I mean, obviously, also the gorgeous cinematography itself. But can you talk a little bit about how some of that stuff plays into the bigger narrative?
Well, I think you know we often talk about difficult subjects, right? Like horrific stories. Um, but for me, it's like cinema is inherently beautiful. That's the
Mm,
thing. It's like and it must be beautiful. This contrast between beauty and horror is very important. And I think if an image is beautiful, it will draw you in, and it will burn itself into your mind and your heart, kind of like the work of Goya, right? Like Goya
mm,
made all these
hmm.
paintings and all these lithographs of really horrific things that he lived in his time, but they're so beautifully rendered. And this contrast is what makes them linger in your mind. And so with 499, I was very lucky to work with cinematographer Jano Mejia, who's a dear friend of mine. And from early on, he said, you know what, like, we need to shoot this in anamorphic. Anamorphic is this very widescreen aspect ratio that you see in classic, epic movies like Gladiator or Spartacus or Lawrence of
Right.
Arabia, right? And what he was saying was like, take this format that is used for big Hollywood epic stories about history, and let's use it and bring it out into the streets and into the mountains of Mexico, and let's create an epic documentary where we take this language and we reappropriate it and we turn it inside out. And here we are, like, using this grammar of cinema that is, considered very cinematic and very challenging to shoot in this format, and let's use it to tell these stories, and that way we'll be able to bring the conquistador and the real people into the same space. And then on top of that, he kind of imposed a personal challenge on himself of working with natural light, only
Oh,
available
okay.
sources. So the film looks incredibly painterly, right? Because all the
It's
light is
gorgeous.
natural. Yeah. And so whenever we would shoot, like for instance, like the conquistador picking up a plastic cup and realizing, what the hell is this cup? And like,
Right.
where am I? There's something
Oh,
really
by the
wrong.
way, one of my favorite, well, lots of moments, but one of my favorite moments, just the absurdity of was it a Cadillac that picked him up? The drug dealer picks him up in a Cadillac.
Yeah, it's a Chrysler. It's like a luxury
Chrysler.
car.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, I don't know my cars too well, but just the absurdity of that, and what, what's going through the conquistador's mind at that point.
Yeah, there was a really good synergy between me, the cinematographer Jano, and Eduardo, the actor, who was also just fascinating. And he was in such a vibe, like he had hit like a frequency, and he arrived
Mm,
with these like really long fingernails that you see in the film. And he was in this mindset of like, I'm in the 16th century. I don't cut my
right.
fingernails, right? People had these horribly long fingernails, and he knew how to move with this very, very ghost-like rhythm, but it didn't feel
Yes.
forced like a ghost. And then, like our cinematographer Hano was in like this great rapport with him. So we would pull over on the side of the road and find these ruined police cars, and then the conquistador would walk through them, and we all kind of knew what we had to do to kind of take that scene to that epic level. And I think it becomes very rewarding when you watch the film, because here he is, this ghost, and he feels so authentic and so confident that he belongs in this place. The film could have ended up being like an inadvertent comedy, right? And
I suppose that's true. Yep.
yeah, there's a reason why so many movies about like characters traveling in time are comedies, because that's and I love some of those movies, but it's the go-to reaction. Like, really lean into the anachronism and laugh about it,
Yeah.
right?
This is no Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure.
Yes, it's not. And I found that very challenging, like to make it not about the comedy. I feel like there are funny moments, but to make it not about the comedy was really, really challenging, because there's no
Well, I would imagine.
references.
And Rodrigo, I would imagine a film like this, when you just don't know the experimentation of it and so on, and there's such a personal, in some cases, gut-wrenching storytelling as well going on, and the authenticity of that, I guess it could have gone sideways pretty easily, I suppose, right? And yet and this is one of the things I just so love, the serendipity of filmmaking. The coming together in your vision as the director, and some of it's serendipity, and obviously some of it's gifting and craft and strategy and all that as well. But how you brought the right people together, and here's this actor Eduardo who's able to communicate these things with his face and his voice, and just, yeah. Anyway, the magic of all that is just so marvelous for me. Anyway, I just wanted to celebrate that a little bit with you.
Yeah, and it's important to kind of like spread that passion and that
Mm.
vision with your team, right? Like everybody, from the writer that I collaborated with to kind of write this like kind of like story map, or like the script was really like a list of intentions that we needed
Oh,
to seek
interesting.
out. From that collaborator Lorena Padilla, all the way to the editors, Daniela and Andrea, like I had to kind of like really sell people on the passion that I had for this project, because
Hmm.
that passion, once you kind of like connect it to someone else and they kind of latch onto it, that's where you're going to find the answers, because I don't have the answers. I just have this crazy idea, and I need
Right.
everyone else to kind of be hunting
Right.
for
Right.
ideas. We got to hunt together for these ideas, and land this film. So it was a process from the beginning to the end of just constantly renewing that passion.
Would film directors make good gamblers?
No, because I think we would gamble it all away very quickly. But I think it pays off to gamble with people that are passionate
Right.
about,
Yes.
because when you're a
Absolutely.
team, you can get it done, and very early on, we were thinking about making this film with producer Inti Cordera, based in Mexico City, and Inti suggested the idea of using these like multiple characters from history, and having them reflect on different problems in Mexico. And soon we realized, we can only do one. It has to be the conquistador. If we had to pick one, it has to be the conquistador, and from there on, like we had the passion to make this film, and
Mm.
and we fell in love with that idea, and it got us through all the obstacles, the classic stuff of filmmakers always dealing with funding and everything, but just really like believing in that ghost, and being excited about him even before we had Eduardo and we had the amazing costume that he wears, like all this other stuff before it became real. That passion kind of is what keeps you going, right? Like, I mean, this was a 5-year process to make this movie.
Yeah, it's remarkable. Sadly, we're coming to the end of our conversation. Perhaps there's a part two in our future. I mean, I think your film's about the future. I love the dreamlike nature of where we're heading, and I trust that people will watch this and be able to walk away with a sense of hope amidst tragedy and uncertainty and 500 years of tarnished kind of history. He asked the question right at the end of the film, what became of, I think, my glory? What became of my treasure? And do you think that film really does have the power to get people to step back and ask those big questions? Those are pretty big existential questions, it seems to me.
Yeah, I think we do have art has the power to move us to question our lives, right? I mean, and art is the chronicle of our existence, right? Like
Mm,
all our questions, all our doubts have to be represented in our art. Otherwise, our art becomes meaningless. And so I think films have that power because, it isn't about a film changing the world. It's about a film as a work of art that empowers us to do
mm,
what we need to do in the world, right? And there's a great need for change, and maybe 499 is a way of questioning, why we need to change and where we need to go, and just really inspiring that. But I have no idea what viewers in Toronto will go on and do after watching 499.
right.
They know their challenges, they know
Yes.
what they need to deal with. um, and so all I can do with my film is just really like present this enormous question mark in the most compelling way that I can, and just get you to really, really feel this ghost of the conquistador, and you will
Mm.
do with it what you will, right? And I trust that most human beings are decent, and just, they want to see things improve, and whatever that is fine with me.
So good. Compelling, enormous question mark. It appeals to the philosopher in me for sure. Rodrigo, you've made a beautiful film and a historic piece too. It seems to me, and one I hope that people will be watching over the next 8 to 12 months, but in perpetuity for years to come. It's a stunning piece and a moving film. Thank you so much. And we've been talking with Rodrigo Reyes today about his new film, 499, winner of the Special Jury Prize at the Hot Docs Film Festival. And I was going to say, Rodrigo, soon coming to a theater near you, but I guess that's probably not true in the very near future. But
Yeah, that's on hold
def-
for now, but you can watch it online at the
you can
Hot Docs Virtual Festival.
absolutely. Thank you so much for your time today, Rodrigo. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, David.